Okay, welcome everyone to this panel on China and India.
I haven't brought my card, sorry.
To put this in a little bit of context, for some of the other sessions we've been talking about the 20th anniversary of ROK-China diplomatic relationships and the year of friendship in China-India relations. This year the focus has been the 50th anniversary of the border war, and there's been a huge amount of focus on that dimension over the last year. I think what the panelists today are going to try to do is look at some of the underlying factors and some of the historical context for a relationship that in recent years in particular I think has somewhat resumed its balance of greater emphasis on strategic competition. But I'm also going to be pressing them. I think we've seen in the last year in particular a bit of an effort to stabilize that on both sides. We have four excellent panelists joining us today. On the Indian side, General Gera, consultant and head of research at the United Service Institution of India. His colleague, in a sense, a council member at the United Service Institution of India, General Katoch, has come out of a long career in the Special Forces. Jia Liaying, professor at Beijing Language and Culture University, where he focuses on China's diplomacy and international organizations, and Li Tao, professor at Sichuan University, her focus in particular on South Asian social and cultural studies. In fact, I should note, all of their biographies are in your packs apart from Li Tao, so I just introduce her a little bit more. She's the professor and executive director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at Sichuan University, deputy editor-in-chief of the South Asian Studies Quarterly, member of the editorial board of International Politic, and vice chairperson of the Chengdu South Asian Association for Economic Trade Cooperation, as well as a member of the China-India Friendship Association. If you've looked at the talking points on the website, you'll see some of the different emphasis that the speakers are going to be bringing on this. Some emphasis on the cooperation despite the historic burdens of the relationship, some analysis of regional competition, but in conjunction with economic partnership. And for a couple of the other speakers, I think you'll see them draw out some of their own research backgrounds on the social and cultural dimension of the relationship as well. So to start us off, and just to remind all of the speakers, you'll have 5 to 7 minutes, and I will be rigorous about trying to enforce that. Begin with General Gera.
Thank you very much. I consider it as a matter of great privilege and honor for me for having been invited for this session, it has been indeed a very professionally stimulating seminar, and I'm grateful to Asan Institute for Policy Studies for having invited me. As has already been brought out, the topic for discussion during this session is China and India. China and India have historically been regional competitors and economic partners. Even in the modern times, both the countries continue to be functioning at two levels: cooperation in trade and economics fields, and divergence in fields of regional security and other security issues. As far as economic cooperation is concerned, China and India accounted for nearly 40% of the global output until late 18th century. Colonization of India and semi-colonization of China dealt a blow as far as Asia's preeminence in the economic field is concerned. And China's high growth rate from 1978 onwards and India's from 1991 onwards have revived the promise of Asian giants regaining their previous economic clout. China has followed the path of manufacturing, assembly, and processing, and emerged as a factory of the world, including for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, comprising primarily of about 34 rich nations. India has focused more on information technology-enabled services and has emerged as a software hub. In addition, India has done well in skill-intensive manufacturing, automobile components, and pharmaceutical and biotechnology. The paths that the two nations have followed are different, and they are primarily because of the internal structure conditions in their political economics. However, both China and India and their economies have done well. As far as their engagement is concerned, well, trade and investment between the two countries has expanded steadily over a period of time. China has become India's largest trading partner, with trade crossing about $75 billion annually, although the balance of payments is in favor of China. There are a number of institutional India-China dialogues, including economic strategy. Mutual economic stakes between the two countries are increasing at a fast pace, and these would compel them to continue to remain engaged. As far as cooperation on global issues are concerned, India and China have cooperated credibly as far as climate change, pollution control, and multi-trade agreements are concerned. India's relations with major powers: India has strategic partnership with the United States of America. India is also friendly with other major powers like Russia, China, Japan, and so on. India is a member of the trilateral India-Russia-China Forum, an observer on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and a member of BRICS, acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, let's talk a bit about areas of divergence. And broadly, these are, firstly, growing India-US partnership. China's concern on US pivot or rebalancing have emerged as Beijing's foreign policy focus, and it is likely to cast a shadow on India-China ties. In fact, ever since the Indo-US civilian nuclear peaceful deal, China has been unhappy about India's growing proximity to the United States of America. In fact, upswing in the Indo-US relations has the potential of altering the geopolitical landscape in the Asia-Pacific region. And to that extent, China would not, therefore, want to push these two countries to have some reasons to come together even further. The overall situation, however, does enable India to deal with the situations more deftly now than in the past. The second issue is China-Pakistan nexus. China is widely believed to have helped Pakistan to acquire nuclear and missile capabilities. China has built Gwadar port on Pakistan's Makran coast to acquire access to Gulf oil and to be able to send it back home either along the Karakoram highway or through a pipeline, for which the work is going on. In Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, PLA persons are believed to be working on a number of projects. There are apprehensions in India that in the event of military conflict, China may use Pakistan and its territory against India. The third issue, land border dispute. China is in illegal occupation of Indian territory in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Areas are Aksai and Shaksgam Valley. In addition, China has been claiming state of Arunachal Pradesh as southern Tibet. Now, this dispute has been carrying on for a long time, and it can be a flashpoint in the event of things going wrong. Tibetan issue. The Dalai Lama sought asylum, shall we say, refuge in India in the year 1959. Over a lakh Tibetan refugees also came to India. They all continue to stay in India, and China is not very happy about it. Tibetan refugees in India, although are not allowed to carry out political activities against China while they are on the Indian soil. However, China continues to be apprehensive about it. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, China is a rising power. Its continued rise is likely to lead to increased strategic assertion vis-à-vis her competitors. China follows a policy of restraining India politically and at the same time seeks enhanced economic cooperation and engagement. India may follow the policy of engaging China and at the same time balance it by developing viable political, diplomatic, economic, and military leverages in consonance with her legitimate aspirations and national interests. In real-world scenario, capabilities matter more than the intent. India should, in my perception, continue to build comprehensive national power to realize her full potential and occupy her place in the Committee of Nations over a period of time. Well, that brings me to the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Gera. Professor Jia.
Okay. Thanks the friends of Asan and distinguished guests. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to exchange on the relations between India and China. Now, my topic is focused on some thoughts on the contemporary relations of Sino-India. Firstly, my part one is the China's literature concerning the relations of Sino-India. This literature could be divided below. First, by time. For instance, during the Cold War or after the Cold War, or on each term of the country leader, such as Mao, Deng, Jiang, Hu, or Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, etc. Secondly, by circle of relations between the two sides, such as from clashing cooperation to friendly cooperation to hostile indifferences. Thirdly, by cognitive period, such as neither enemy nor friend, kind friend, enemy, neither enemy nor friend. The fourth is by problematic sectoral division, such as politics, economy, security, and culture. The fifth is by the language and the nationality. The sixth is by research methods, historical, political, or psychological. Part two is about the relations of Sino-India embedded in the multi-structure. Actually, there are a lot of structures between India and China. The first level is multilateral diplomatic structure, such as South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, Asia and Europe Meeting, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, G20, the mechanism of China-India-Russia cooperation, East Asia Summit, G8+5, basic BRICS. The second level is the relations of Sino-India in the structure of international politics. It is one superpower and several powers. The superpower is decreasing, and China and India are rising. The third level is the relations of Sino-India in the changing international economic structure. According to the Goldman Sachs predict, the big five of economic power will be China, USA, India, Brazil, and Mexico in 2050. Part 3, the orientation of present Sino-India relations by Chinese people. It also be divided into different levels. From the government level, the strategic and cooperative partnership for peace and prosperity between the two sides. The leader of two sides pay attention to Sino-India relations on the strategic point. For instance, in 1988, Deng Xiaoping told Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi that no Asia-Pacific century or Asian century would come without the development of China and India and other developing countries. In 2005, China Premier Wen Jiabao said there is no war forever between China and India. In 2008, India Prime Minister Mohammad Singh said in Beijing, there is enough space in the world for the development of both China and India, and enough areas for the two countries to cooperate. Prime Minister Mohammad Singh also observed that when India and China speak with one voice, the world will listen. The strategic and cooperative partnership embodied in the joint state of 2005, the 2006 joint declaration and shared vision on 21st century in 2008. In January of 2012, Chinese State Councilor Dai Bingguo wrote an article to Indian press, The Hindu. He said, "It is our genuine hope that India will enjoy prosperity and its people happiness. There does not exist such a thing as China's attempt to attack India or suppress India's development. What we face is a golden period to grow China-India relations. The world has enough space for China and India to achieve common development, as there are so many areas for us to work together." He expressed the kindness of China to Indian people. It is the first time that the Chinese high official wrote a paper on Sino-India relations to Indian media. It did reflect something. The second level is the scholars. The Chinese scholar often emphasize the two sides of positive and negative. The relations is uncertain. It depends on the concrete conditions. The third level is the common people. The common Chinese people have a different idea. Some don't care. Some have not certain opinions. Some are very sensitive and emotional. Part 4, the latest development and the communication mechanism. From 2011, the two sides began to launch the mechanism of regular mutual visits by heads of state and government. The hotline between two premiers is opened so that they could exchange views at any time. The year 2011 was the year of China-India exchanges. In this March, President Wen Jiabao and President Hu Jintao and Prime Minister announced starting 2012 as the year of China-India friendship and cooperation. From 2008, the regular exchange mechanism between CPPCC and the People's House of India Parliament started.
Professor Zhao, if I can encourage you to finish up soon.
Okay. I will be very briefly. The suggestions of how to improve the relations further. My opinion is very positive. To enlarge contact, to increase mutual trust, strengthen mechanism, and construct the future. Because we have the same historical fate, same task of development. We are geographical neighbor, and we have the possibilities and the necessities. Our 2.5 billion populations occupy the 1/3 of the globe. So I'm very optimistic about the future between China and India. Okay, that's all.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I'd like to say my grateful thanks to Asan Institute to give me an opportunity to address you all. General Gera has spoken of most of the issues, so let me go back in history a little bit. In my perception, both the civilizations of China and India have had some striking resemblances. You take, say, in the 3rd century BC, that is the time the first emperor of China integrated all the small kingdoms and established the first dynasty in China. And at the same time in India, the Mauryan dynasty came into being, which subsequently extended its empire, and in fact, the western border was the Hindu Kush mountains of what is today Afghanistan. Then you had the evolution of philosophical thinking, both in China and India in the 6th century BC. You had Confucius in China. You had Siddhartha Gautam in India, who founded the Buddhism. You had Buddhism travel from India to China, and from China it went to Japan and some of the Southeast Asian countries. Both these civilizations had their own spheres of influence. You see the Chinese influence today even in Northeast Asia and certain Southeast Asian countries. Similarly, as far as India is concerned, you see it right down till Indonesia. Both these countries were invaded by alien tribes. But despite that, both the countries could retain their civilization. In China, it was Confucianism. In India, it was Hinduism. Then you see that in 1947, India got its independence. And in 1949, after the War of Liberation, the new China came into being. And that was actually the golden period between these two countries. But like it happens in long histories, relations between two countries, then things started going wrong. And in 1959, the Dalai Lama, with about 1 lakh Tibetans, took refuge in India, and they are still in India, although they are not permitted to do anything political from Indian soil. And then the 1962 war happened. Why that happened? Because of what political compulsions on the leaderships of both countries, I don't want to go into, but the fact is the war did take place. And it was timed significantly with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, the day the Cuban Missile Crisis got over, China declared a ceasefire and withdrew. After that, there was a lukewarm period till 1988, when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi went to China. And that is the time that 4 mechanisms were put into place. The first was border talks. The second was high-level summits. The third was CBMs. And the fourth was bilateral trade. Now, both the countries opened up, went in for reforms and economic upliftment, and have had various degrees of success in various fields. The fact is today that China and India, the population is 1/5 of the humanity of the entire world. And what is going to happen in these two countries in the next few decades is going to affect the rest of the world also. Now, the question which is always asked is, despite the historical baggage, are China and India going to cooperate? Now, let me talk about those 4 mechanisms which had been put in place earlier. Border talks, there have been 15, 16 rounds of talks, but frankly, there's been no outcome, although people say that there is a little progress. As far as the high-level summits is concerned, yes, at times there have been sporadic meetings, but there are more meetings on the sidelines of various international events. As far as the CBMs go, well, they are continuing, but in my perception, the requirement is to include the nuclear CBMs, the naval CBMs, and discussion on water. I'd like to bring out here that by 2030, Indian population is going to overtake the Chinese population. That is going to be the mass of humanity in India. And despite that, India has access to only 4% of the freshwater reserves of the entire world. So as far as India is concerned, what is the major problem? There's a requirement of talks between China and India. Then you come the bilateral trade. As brought out, already $75 billion by 2015 should touch $120, $130 billion. The problem is that today, out of that $75 billion, $50.5 billion is in China's favor. So this requires a course correction because the small-scale industries in India are getting affected because of that. Now, when you talk of cooperation, there are apprehensions. What are the apprehensions? Apprehensions about the border settlement. Apprehensions are about interference in internal matters by the other side. There are apprehensions about the relationship with Pakistan, not only the nuclear issue, specifically because Pakistan is the epicenter of terrorism and it is directing major terrorism into India and Afghanistan. And of course, the recent apprehensions are the Chinese development activities in the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, whereas they are objecting to India doing any oil exploration in Vietnamese waters, which is not a new thing, which started 10 years back. So these are the issues which you have apprehensions because of that. In addition, since both are developing countries, there will be apprehensions about the arms race. There will be apprehensions about energy, resources, the supply lines. These apprehensions are going to continue. The main issue which is of concern is that between the two countries, there is no institutionalized framework for talks on wide-ranging issues. It is sporadic what is taking place. A lot of people will not know that the UNSC seat that China has was first offered to India. And it is the Indian Prime Minister who said that no, it is the big brother who should get it first. But after that, all along, China has not been in favor of India getting a UNSC seat. Although recently an official statement has been made saying that China recognizes the Indian aspirations to participate in UN reforms, but period, that's it. China has welcomed India into the East Asian Summit, and hopefully China will also help India get a permanent membership in the SCO. So that is where we are as of today. What happens in future, it actually depends on China. I'd like to flag one or two more issues before I conclude. First is, wherever you go, you talk, you get a feedback that let us have a policy of engagement with China. But the fact is that this policy has been in vogue for the past several decades. This is not a new policy. The second is that on every issue, whether it is India, China border talks, whether it is a six-party issue, six-party talks, they say that there is a little progress. I think what needs to be analyzed is what is that progress? And is that something which can be called a progress? The third thing is that there is time and again emphasis on peaceful rise of China. I'm of the opinion that firstly, every country is rising in the world. And no country, over a long period of history, over a long period of time, can have a sustained peaceful growth, a peaceful rise. There are going to be episodes which are not peaceful, and there are going to be episodes which are peaceful. And the same thing is happening with China also. In fact, there are, in recent time, there have been some signals which have been emanating from China, which cannot be termed as peaceful by any measure. And some of these signals, in my perception, are not even known to the Chinese population because the media in China is controlled. The last issue which I want to give is that in my perception, the biggest threat to China is internal dissent. And that is something which the new leadership will have to look into. That is the biggest threat to China. And as happens in all countries all over the world, what has been happening is that when such a thing is happening, the political authority tries to divert the attention. So maybe that is one of the reasons that the political authority will like little hotspots left, right, and center, ensuring it does not escalate into war. But by doing that, you raise the level of nationalism in the country and you divert the attention from dissent within the country to nationalism towards external threat. That is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Professor Lee.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thanks, Asan Institute, host the floor. And just a moment, three gentlemen talk about Sino-Indian relation from the big. I just want to from a small Tibetan issue. Just first mentioned this. The first everybody talk about the first center will be the Asian center, the study of a relation between the two major powers in Asia, China and India, has attracted a lot of attention. As an important part of the Indian nation security strategy and its the China policy, Tibetan issue is undoubtedly indispensable probable to the concern in Sino-Indian relation. To a certain degree, it is a car employed by the Indian government to contain China. I think so. I prepare for a section historic background and 5/4 passage and 3 major features and some conclusion. But just 5 minutes, I talk about the major feature. I think this is a 5-point major feature. First is inheritance, and second is consistency, and double seed, double seed, and coverless. Fourth is coverless, and 5 First is inheritance. India has inherited most of the processions and concepts with regard to Tibetan policy from the British in colonialists. The second, the consistency. By some tactic difference between the six Indian government, New Delhi has maintained a basic consistent Tibetan policy. Acknowledge Tibetan as a part of China and forbidding Tibetans from anti-China political activities from Indian soil. This three double-sided list. India has used the Dalai Lama groups as a tool for pressurize China and tried to turn Tibet into the buff state in service of in New Delhi's strategic interest. At the same time, being trapped by its own separatism in Kashmir and Northeast. India has to act prudently on issue of ethnic separatism and has hence never openly supported Tibetan independence. It is seek a set of outside mission, such as maintaining normal relations with China while retaining or initiative over Tibetan issue. Acknowledge that Tibetan autonomous region as an integrated part of China and thus forbidding Tibetan from anti-China political activities from Indian soil, where often or cover hand to the Dalai Lama group's separatist activities. Cooperation with anti-China activities of the West, especially American, over Tibetan issue will keep certain distance with them. Means not all follow the West. Fourth, coverage. Since some of Indians' politics on Tibetan issue is against its open diplomatic conceptualization, such as non-interference into domestic affairs of another nation. India has to hide some of its contents in order to show away the alarmness and opposition from China. Finally, chronicity means longer. India's Tibetan policy was decided by its consideration on geopolitical and nation security issues. Being caught by a levers and cautious, maintain it with regard to China. India could hardly change its strategic size of constrain China through Tibetan issue. The political strategy of domestic party in China, in India, and Washington's Tibetan policy further complete this situation. It is predictable that India will keep Tibetan policy of decidedly short of the substantial sudden changes in international and its domestic situation. I just asking two gentlemen, maybe in my conclusion, India's Tibetan policy will meet with emerging changes in post-Dalai Lama era. First, it has directed deal with the Tibetan government in exile, which is a government short for admission from any country. Second, terror and violence orientations among Tibetan youth, Jews will be a negative factor for Sino-Indian relations as well as for the stability of China, Indian itself. Yeah. Third, Tibetan independent elementals will join support from the tradition anti-China element in the American and European. Its activities trying to expand its activities onto other parts of Asia. Yeah, so in such a context, India perhaps need to renewing its things on Tibetan policy. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to the floor in a minute, but first of all, just going to give the panelists a chance to respond to each other's points and some of the points that they've raised, but just also to throw in another question as well. In a sense, coming from something that General Gira raised in his presentation, in one sense, you can look at some of the evolution of China-India relations and the direction it's taken in the context of what's gone on US-India relations. In your presentation, General Gira, you said that since China didn't want to push relations between India and the United States closer together, and if anything, though, it has seemed that since the nuclear deal, that's exactly what China's done. And I mean, the response to the nuclear deal, not just on how China's handled its relationship with India, but with Pakistan too, and even around the nuclear deal itself, the last country to be holding out on the agreement of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and so on. It seemed, in a sense, that China's response to it has been to kind of push some of those strategic dyads again, the China-Pakistan and this sort of new India-US relationship. I'd just be kind of keen to get your responses to the role that you see the United States now playing in this relationship, and as well as that, if you'd like to take the chance to respond to points from any of the other panelists, then do go ahead. And if I could start with you, General Gira.
I would like to first respond to what you have said. The fact is that in the world today, there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies. There are only permanent national interests. And when US and India have signed this civil peace nuclear deal, it is in the interest of both the nations. Perhaps more in our interest, but at the same time, US is also looking at its global interests. To that extent, it has helped both the countries. It has helped us in getting over the regimes which were restricting us from technology, from various other areas, and it has helped Pakistan, it has helped America in reframing its geopolitical issues. Like, for example, China is now focusing on the policy of what US is trying to say, Asia-Pacific region, whatever rebalancing they are wanting to do. So to that extent, China has also taken a stock of the situation. Maybe China has started restricting some of its own activities, which previously it was proactive as far as India is concerned. To that extent, its relations with Pakistan are not getting boosted up to the extent that they were happening in the past. Even as far as, shall we say, terrorism is concerned, which was causing a lot of concern in India, we find that the effect is there and it has gone down. So this, it may be only civil nuclear deal, but its ramifications are wide-ranging. They are to our interest, they are to American interest. They are also reshaping the global structure. So I think it has been something which is of far-reaching consequences. To that extent, both the nations gain, and even perhaps globally, we stand to gain ultimately, because at some stage, US and China have also got to draw their own equations, and so have the other peripheral nations. I am definitely of the opinion that it has helped India, and I said so. I said now India has can handle things more deftly to our advantage as compared to what it was happening before.
Okay. Thanks very much. Professor Jiao, before I go to General Kataj.
I think General Gira and Professor Kotach's opinion are very thoughtful, but they have a different side. General pay more attention to the problem between China and India, and Professor Kotach pay more attention to the cooperation field the two sides could do. Indeed, in the relations between any countries, there are the two sides, negative and positive one. And I am a little bit different with General's opinion, is that in the world politics, there are a lot of actors, the government, the people, the individual. So, I mean, there are friends between different levels, such as between Chinese people and the Indian people, between Chinese people and the Korean people, and other countries' people. We are friends. As for the problem, for instance, the general mentioned the border issue or the relations between China and Pakistan, or the issue of Indian nuclear weapons. They are the old problem. It lasted for a very long time. I think we cannot wait all the problem be solved, then we began to cooperate. I agree with Professor Kotach's opinion. We could cooperate in many fields, such as energy, water, gasoline, even in the United Nations framework. So I think state is people. We could find a lot of field to cooperate. That's the basic opinion.
Thank you. I'm reminded of a recent strategic dialogue that took place between China and India, in which both sides said that they would make sure not to cover the border issue, not to cover Pakistan, not to cover Sri Lanka, not to cover Nepal, not to cover the Dalai Lama, not to cover Kashmir, and not to cover the Indian Ocean. But any, NDRC thing in November. But General Katoj.
Yeah, I'd like to mention firstly this Indo-US nuclear deal. Now, this is a fairly recent happening which has taken place, whereas the nuclear cooperation between China and Pakistan is much earlier, and even the relationship is much earlier. As far as the border issues are concerned, when I said that there are some wrong signals which are emanating let me tell you what these signals are. For example, why is it not getting resolved? It's not getting resolved because in certain areas, in fact, India and Bhutan are the only two countries with which China has not settled the border. Now, in certain areas, there is a Chinese 59 claim line, there is a 1963 claim line, there is a 1975 claim line, and there is a 1995 claim line, and every time it is increasing. Then you look at the state of Arunachal Pradesh. Till about few years back, about 6 years back, China was only claiming that town of Tawang. And suddenly, Arunachal Pradesh has become South Tibet, that 90,000 square kilometers are required by China now. So what are those signals? When the border talks are on, then please don't talk of this. Last year, the China TV has shown not once, but number of times the map of India when India is being discussed with Arunachal Pradesh, which is part of China, with the entire Kashmir as part of Pakistan. And what I'm saying here, I said in Shanghai, I said in Beijing, and I've said in international seminars. I said, how would you like if we show you a map where Tibet is an independent country? Now, nationalism is not the reserve of China alone. Every country has got nationalists. You can't do things like this. Then, for Kashmir, and Arunachal staple visas were being given. Then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh has met his counterpart at a sideline. They have agreed that it will not be done. Two months it is stopped. Again, that starts off. Now with visas, the map which is being shown is, of course, that also concerns Asia Pacific because South China Sea is entirely as part of China and so is Arunachal Pradesh. Now, what are these signals? This is not peaceful rise, I'm sorry. As far as the India going towards US, you're talking about firstly this US pivot. Well, it has only been a statement as of now. Can somebody explain to me what is the concept of US pivot and where does India fit in? It's just been a statement by President Obama and by Hillary Clinton. And aside from the fact that they've said 60% of the Navy is going to move that way, what is the Asia pivot? Can you explain to me? And as General Gera said, there are no permanent friends and enemies. Now, Chinese people know about the 62 war. Chinese people also know that India asked America for assistance. Last year, the 62 archives in America were declassified. And we find there is a memo by the Secretary of State to the President of the United States saying that let us give India some machine guns so that more territory they don't lose. But in American interest, we should make sure that India and China never get together. When we say there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemy, China has fought wars with Russia. But you have better relations with Russia today than with India. So it is for the Chinese people to think. I'd also like to mention that it does not come into your media, a lot of things, and the Indian government wants to play down things. But China today is meddling with the insurgency in India. And I can give you a number of instances if you want to ask me privately, which has come out in the Indian media also. Now, that sort of a thing is not a peaceful rise, I'm sorry. And this is something which I don't think you know, because your intelligence agencies are doing it, but your PLA will know because you got PLA members in the Politburo. It cannot be done on their own, but this is happening on ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to jump in, Professor Lee, or can I go to Huang Jing, who I saw was... I'm going to go to Huang Jing.
Yeah, I have two comments. First on Tibet, another on China-India relationship in general. First, I'm not sure if Mrs. Lee's presentation on Tibet is your own opinion or Chinese government's official position, but you made several mistakes. 你犯了很多错误. First, and now the Tibetan government exile is no longer called the Tibetan government exile, it's called Tibetan Central Administration. And second, if you look at all the official dialogues between China and India, Tibet was never mentioned. And third, in the past 30 years in my memory, Chinese government, officially or privately, never ever criticized India for using Tibet as a leverage to contain China. That's a Chinese official position. Fourth, it is India's official position that Tibet is part of China, and India respects that. Last but not the least, it is not Indian government's official policy to allow the Dalai Lama and his people use India to engage in any political activities against China. For example, in 2009, when Dalai Lama was visiting Taiwan, Indian government bent backward to prevent any reporters or journalists to report Dalai Lama's activities in Taiwan. And I can also say that actually privately, Chinese government appreciate Indian government's handle of Indian Tibet issue. Can you imagine if Dalai Lama's government exile or Tibetan administration is not in India but in any other country? In the past 50 years, Indian government, in my view, has never really used Tibet against China, handle it very, very carefully. So I really don't know why you say that. You criticize Indian government's Tibet policy. I don't think that's, frankly, I think that's groundless. And that's my view. And on China-Indian relationship, we have conducted a China-Indian relation project in the past 2 years with Kandi Bajpai and Kishore Mahbubani. And we have organized 2 rounds of high-level policy dialogue between China and India, closed door. And my understanding that there are several issues between China and India. And the very short-term ones, as you mentioned, the border disputes and Pakistan. On the border dispute, both sides actually see it as a domestic issue rather than bilateral issue. Because the border problem is created neither by Chinese nor by the Indians, it's by the British. So both sides has a deep, deep-seated resentment against the past. So as a result, both sides, I believe, realize this is not an issue for solution in the short term. It's an issue for management. That's why last year when Dai Bingguo visited Delhi, India and China reached an agreement called the Mechanism for Border Dispute Management. In other words, they try to manage the issue so that it will not escalate into a crisis. On Pakistani issue, the development in the past years has shown, number one, persistent dominance of military in Pakistan politics. Number two, very fast expansion of extremist forces. Number three, massive involvement of foreign countries, for example, Saudis in Pakistan. All of this are bad news for India, but also bad news for China, especially after the riot in Xinjiang a couple of years ago. So in my view, a lot of Chinese leaders began to realize Pakistan has become more and more a liability rather than asset to China. And the equation is very simple. Only by working with Indians can China and India jointly manage the Pakistani issue so that Pakistan will return, hopefully, into stability and development. But the 2 other issues between China and India that deserves long-term attention. Number one, trade imbalance, which is not sustainable. Number two, rising nationalism in both countries. There is a huge gap between public opinion and the leadership perception. In both leaderships, in my view, in Beijing and New Delhi, they want a good relationship because neither China nor India will carry other people's water. You said that. They have national interests there. So the kind of speculation that India will be on United side to contain China is a pure speculation. That's it. On the other hand, however, the public opinion in both countries see each other in a not very friendly way. Like you said, in a map issue, the so-called, of course, the passport was issued by the Ministry of Public Security, not by Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think that's a very stupid mistake, in my view. But anyway, having said that, I do have confidence that China and India will not become enemy to each other. If there's any chance, I think they will become in a more friendly relationship. I think that is good for China and India, and that is good for the entire world. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go back to the panel to respond to a couple of those points. But if I can take maybe one more question so that people can cogitate. Laura Salmon.
Thank you. My question actually pertains to something which several of the panelists brought up about this idea of a regularized mechanism. for discussions between the two countries. Because, and I believe that Andrew Small alluded to this, the whole idea of having a strategic economic dialogue between the two countries. It's been held twice, obviously, and a number of things have been taken off the table. My discussions with Indian embassy officials in Beijing, they've said that essentially the strategic side is taken off the table. It's an economic dialogue, but and so quite often a number of the issues that you brought up today are just taboo and not mentioned. So my question is, do you think that within the China-India strategic economic dialogue, do you think this should change? Do you think that it should be split, meaning to have a strategic dialogue and to have an economic dialogue separate from one another? Because I ask this because there's obviously a U.S.-China strategic economic dialogue, and it's a very different setup. It's a very different mechanism. And if strategic issues should be included in the future, where do you think the priorities lie from all of the things that you've mentioned today? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go back to the panel. I'm just finishing a book on China-Pakistan relations at the moment, and that's the first time I've ever heard the phrase from Hongjin, the joint management of the Pakistan situation between China and India. Oh, you also said the Pakistan situation.
No, I said Pakistan situation in China has realized more and more Pakistan's become liability as an asset. But I don't think there's any agreement between China, India, and Pakistan issue. I said,
oh, clearly not.
Working with India, in my view, can China, India manage Pakistan issue? It's not. The agreement is on border issue.
I'll go back to the panel. General Gira?
Okay. I quite agree that this border issue, to an extent, is legacy of and a historical baggage. There's no doubt about it. And I suppose we can't squarely even blame our previous governments. The reason is the communications were not so developed. The modes of accession was not there. Hardly anybody scaled those peaks. And Himalayas were considered as a barrier. The border was being managed more by tradition as to who is where, when, and how, and what are their affiliations, who is paying tax to whom. So those are the practical points on the ground. And nationally, some nations manage their affairs in a spoken manner, others do it on paper. Now in India, unfortunately, we hardly get down to writing things. We manage things more orally. So therefore, maybe the documents which are held with China and India, somebody can sit across, go over them, sort them out. That is the only way. The only way to find a solution is by sitting across the table, discussing it out, weighing up the facts, and also the evidence that is available, and come to a logical conclusion. But that can happen only when the environment is what it should be. Because if we are trying to find faults with each other, then the negativity prevails more than the positive issue. There is a need for us to create the congenial environment to be able to do so. If we only keep on finding faults, okay, 1962, China did this, and so we did this, we'll get nowhere. And the only mature way for big nations, big civilizations, is to find a solution amicably across the table. And I also must correct in case I have given a wrong impression. I have brought in both the issues. I said we are cooperating in economic and other fields, and perhaps in the strategic areas there are certain divergences. There are no nations where there are no sort of divergences. But only thing is, if we just keep on sweeping them under the carpet, then they do that at the track one level, and if we don't discuss it in the seminars also, then things will keep on simmering, and sometimes it will blow up. I personally feel that when these things are put in the open on the table, and we think about them, and the people also get to know as to what is going on, I think the approach will give us a better solution. And that's the reason why when I made my presentation, I first talk of the cooperation that we have. I also touched on the topics where we can cooperate and proceed in the positive direction. At the same time, I said these are the areas where there are divergences, which we should rationally analyze, think, and see if we can solve them. Approach should be positive to solve a problem rather than trying and sort of finding faults in each
Thank you. I think I should give Professor Lee a chance to respond in particular on the Tibet issue. And I'd actually like to just invite both of the Chinese speakers as well to respond to General Katoch's point about the China's support meddling with the insurgencies in India, which one often sees raised, but it's often very difficult to get a response from the Chinese side. When I asked one Chinese friend about it, he said, "I wish we were doing it. We're not really doing it. If it is happening, it's not strategically directed from the centre." But anyway, I'm keen to get responses from that, particularly given Professor Lee's raised the Tibet issue in that context. Professor Lee.
I play, gentlemen. Just mention I talk about the government. I'm not Miss Chen Tibetan government, but as usual in the international use this, so we just so I don't mean the government, Tibet government, just in English. So maybe this is a misunderstand. And you means you told me the Indian government not use the card Tibet as a Tibetan issue as a card, but I just ask you when Chinese leader visiting the Indian. Often Indian government put many Tibetan free in the control them. When after that make it free. So and we dialogue in the when we talk about the border issue. Indians sometimes use a bargain chip with the Tibetan issue. So many things. I just mentioned the Indian government translate a double side. Sometimes short, complex meaning. Another in truth to another. Maybe I think just like everybody talk now. Distrust. We need people to people, especially in media in India. We should people to people more things. Now, Sailor Indian cooperation more on the politics, but upside people from more and more Chinese go visiting Indian, but few Indian people visiting China, and so I think in the Sino-Indian relationship, it's very important to lead to people.
Okay, thank you. And we're just in the last couple of minutes now, so I'm going to give Professor Dia a chance to respond to a couple of these things. If you could also bear Laura Salmon's question in mind, and then General Katoch will have the last word. Professor Dia.
I'm very excited about all the questions, but my belief is India and China should be good friends. Although indeed we have some problem in different field, but Indian people is very wise. There are a lot of wisdom for Indian people, and in the past 2,000 years, 99% time we are good friends. So only the very tiny limited period we have some conflict. So I'm sure we will find the proper mechanism to improve our relations and solve the dispute. Okay, it's my opinion.
Okay, thank you. General Kanda.
I'll just like to comment the border issue firstly. There is a school of thought that let's put it in the cold storage, but I think it is important to get it resolved, whichever way. And I think it is going to be advantageous to the Chinese also because it will have its effect on Tibet. So I think it is better to resolve that issue fastest. Whenever we get a lot of Chinese delegations to India, they talk of that the Indian media is saying this and India media is saying that. Please understand that the media in India is not paid by the government, it is not government. Including the TV channels, odd channel like Doordarshan is government channel, balance are absolutely free. I write profusely, I have written articles in favor of China, I have written articles highly critical of China, I have written articles highly critical of Indian government, I have written articles on India-China cooperation, and they all get published. But if anything comes in the Chinese media, that is taken very seriously, including these maps, etc., being shown. So that is something you have to keep in mind. The question about the strategic dialogue, I mentioned this, that this is missing as of now. That you have to have something institutionalized on a wide-ranging topics. And it could include the economic dialogue also, but I will recommend that it should be separate. For the simple reason that at times you will find that in any particular forum you will have 98% of only the economic agenda and the other agenda is gone. And strategic dialogue is definitely required on issues like Pakistan, on issues like the future of Afghanistan, on the issues like the management of Indian Ocean, of the Indian role in the South China Sea. Now these are issues which have to be discussed, which is not happening as of now. The people-to-people contact. You will find that between India and Pakistan, between India and China, people-to-people contact, there's no problem. The problem is at the government level policies. Although, like I mentioned that both the Chinese government and the Indian government want to shake hands, but certain signals which come, which from that side are actually government. So then there is a problem. I have many Chinese friends, I'm in contact with them. I don't have any problem. Last year my son got married. Out of the foreigners, 5 foreigners invited were the Chinese defense attaché and his assistant in Delhi. They came to my son's wedding. So people to people is not a problem. The problem is what is happening underhand at the higher level. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid we have to wrap up now. I know we started a little bit late. Just like to thank Asan again for convening us here, and if you could thank the excellent speakers.